The next speaker has a fascinating background as a musician, amongst other careers, as a journalist, as an activist, and as a radical animal. So, Pat Kane, tell us your views on the agenda for the future, please.
All right, thank you.
Yeah,
Hi everyone. Just to remind you what my link is, glsr.it/AF03. Don't forget it. Please put your questions up.
Yes, AF03.
Oh yes, that's AF03. Just to say, I'm going to belt through this because although these are fantastic interlocutors on stage, I'd like to hear other people's voices in the room. So what I'm going to do is try and get through this in 15 minutes. Please then talk amongst yourselves. Put your questions in through this means, but if you hear a question inadequately answered, I want to hear you speak. So let's try and do that way, just so I want to feel a bit more human presence in the room, if that's all right. Good. Okay, as I said, I'm a musician and a writer. I'm sort of so intrinsically interested in creativity and play. Radical Animal is a book that myself and Indra Adnan, who's going to be speaking later on, with The Alternative. I'm part of that as well. We're trying to write this book. But the idea of a radical animal, well, I'll explain it. But the title of this lecture, which is not one I quite like not getting titles that I've chosen because it helps you to kind of work and challenge yourself a wee bit. But the title for this lecture is From Homo Economicus to Radical Animal. And I think one of the interesting things when we talk about a future that we want to live in is that we often want it to be a future where human creativity and flourishing and inventiveness and ingenuity is at the core of that society. But we do have debates about that future. We have debates about creativity. I asked a question a couple of months ago on Twitter. It was a request on the basis of a presentation I was making. And I asked people, give me pieces that come to mind about creativity and innovation in organisations. And I got two really great results, both of them completely contradictory. One of them was, hold on, I'm pointing this the wrong way, here we go. One of them was, okay, here's creativity. These are the most creative brands and objects in American retail shelves in 2016. Most of them are food items and 3 of them are healthy snacks. Not quite my idea of creativity, although it is the advertising industry's idea of creativity. You would read down this list, which is actually the presentations on radicalanimal.net, if you want to see it later on. But that's a kind of pretty standard list of things that one might regard as being elements of creativity: breaking rules and taboos, unexpected juxtapositions of ideas, extreme humour. But the question is, what is all this? If we look at, say, the advertising industry as a source of creative impetus for a society, what is it being used for? Anything else other than serving the bottom line of a brand? The other source I got from the web was someone who sent me a book, a PDF book, a book of academic papers called Critique of Creativity, which is coming from the other side, which is basically saying we talk about creativity and innovation because it suits a society that expects us to be endlessly performative in service of market and commercial imperatives. We are creative and innovative because we have to get up to speed with a capitalism that demands our ideas, our emotions, our best thoughts, our best feelings in order to make the whole system work. I'm getting the wrong button here. Here we go. But what's interesting is that if you are a creative, if you self-define as part of the creative class, it's quite interesting. You're becoming kind of self-conscious about this, how the system works in a certain way. So you're beginning to look at the fact the gig economy discussion is the classic one. People are starting to get anxious about the fact that they might have lives that they can compose out of various things that they like to do, but they don't really have any fundamental security, they don't have any backup. And this is why we've started to have this very, very vibrant discussion, cross-ideological discussion about universal basic income, because the idea is if you want to live this flexible, discontinuous creative life, fine, but how do you find some ground that you can land on rather than just constantly fall through the gaps of a safety net that doesn't exist? Universal basic income may be the answer. So what's been interesting to me is that what's begun happening in the last couple of years. I must say my own book, Play Ethic 2004, was kind of anticipating a lot of this, but if you know the Paul Mason book, Post-Capitalism, or the book Imagining the Future from Williams and Cernicek, we are beginning to get big picture visions of what a society would be like if it put the combination of human creativity and the ubiquity of information and knowledge at the core of that system. So we're beginning to get lots of big picture, quite popular and quite successful visions of that. Maybe that's also part of the consensus that is allowing experimentation in various cities and regions and countries of the world on things like universal basic income, Sweden's 6-hour day, new economic models, Jeremy Rifkin in Germany looking at zero marginal cost production. So there's lots of, one could have a look at the idea of seeds of the future in the present, thinking about movements towards a society defined by creativity, and think this is quite optimistic. There's quite a lot of movement here. There's movement in the intellectual world, there's movement in the municipal governance world, and there's maybe also a social movement. Maybe this is what the millennials were born for, to bring forth the politics of a creative society. But. Someone said the T word and the G word. I'm not going to mention the B word, the Brexit word. And I think one of the things that you would pick up from the debate about Brexit, and one of the things you would want to avert, not go anywhere near, is the idea that there is this distinction between the creative classes and the non-creative classes, the forward-looking classes and the stuck back in the past classes, or whether it's flexible, urban, city, cosmopolitan, capacious, creative, inflexible, suburban town, monocultural, recalcitrant, routinized. Now, I'm sure everybody would agree that's a bad polarization to get into, but it's so difficult to try to figure out how to mitigate that polarization. How do we do that? Now, lots of people are trying, we in the alternative, which we'll talk about later, are trying to do that by kind of setting up experiment spaces, labs for thinking of different ways of politics. One of the things I'll just focus on for this presentation is that maybe a shared account of common human nature might help us to heal some of these divides. And if that account of human nature is rich and complex enough, then maybe we can have a general conversation about what kind of good society fits a rich understanding of human nature. Now, this is why I've been interested in play since before the book, 2004, and ever since afterwards, because it's been a sort of a conduit, a gateway for me as a sort of lay person, not really have a scientific background, but it's been a sort of pathway for me into a whole discussion, a whole multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary discussion about, one could say, the politics of human nature, evolved human nature. And one of the interesting, so we all know fight or flight. In recent years, I'll talk about it in a minute, we know about nudge, the idea that we're all sort of Homer Simpsons at heart, that we're mad optimists and we can't assess our situation properly. One of the interesting things to look at play in that account of evolved human nature is that it is adaptive. It does, sometimes play looks as if it's maladaptive, it's wasteful, a bit like sleep and sex. Why do we do so much of it? Well, we do so much of it because we're complex animals and we need to rehearse being with other complex animals. That's the role of play in the account of evolved human nature. That's just a map from Human Givens, which Indra and I work with, from Ekman and Damasio. And this is Jack Panksepp, who's my favourite, a neuroscientist in this, who looks at 7 basic emotional systems, and one of them is play. This is something that we share with not just mammals, but also non-mammals as well. And play for him is just that aspect of getting ready for being with other complex animals, the risks and challenges and threats and joys and delights of them, but to create a zone, proximal zone is what Vygotsky calls it, within which we can rehearse and play being with other complex, and where creativity and innovation comes in. And us preeminently as humans, but not just us. Interesting work, on octopuses and crows and so forth. And absolutely, the whole multidisciplinary science and scholarship of play is completely fascinating as a window into a discussion about human nature, which is often determinist or even Dawkinsist, and actually looking at evolved human nature through the lens of play shows that creativity is really, really deeply adaptive and baked into so many natural processes, including the human processes. If you want to read a fantastic account of this, I would thoroughly recommend Patrick Bateson's and Paul Martin's Play, Playfulness, Creativity and Innovation. Absolutely covers it. And just if you haven't thought about play before, just a simple page that talks about what is definitively play. It's fun, it's action that's protected from normal consequences, it generates novelty, it looks different from normal behaviour, it indicates well-being. When an organism is free from illness or stress, it starts to play. So when you see play, you can tell that there's a sort of fundamental personal, biological, social, communal healthiness in the space. So it's a great indicator. If you follow the play, if you want to see where a society is functioning healthily. Bateson and Martin talk about playful play and playfulness. That's the mood state that's optimum for creativity. Cheerful, frisky, frolicsome, good-natured, joyous, merry, rollicking, etc. And they want to make the point that creativity is not the same as innovation. You know, creativity is the generation of novel actions and ideas by recombining things. Innovation takes those ideas and does the hard work of making them happen. So it's quite an interesting distinction to make between creativity and innovation. And it allows play and the nature of play and the natural drive of play to find a place within many organised settings. If you make that distinction between creativity and innovation, you can create play spaces that are that cross the boundaries between, you know, well-being, psychotherapy, creativity, arts. If you can understand and grok that distinction. So, really important. I think it's really important to look at the effect of neuroscience, as the official term has it. How does neuroscience affect the emotions? And it's really interesting to keep play in mind and joy and creativity as one of those adaptive functions. So there's your account of common human nature, which might be quite attractive. And here's the distinction. Here's why the account I'm painting is, I think, better than the nudge account. The nudgers say we're all Homer Simpsons at heart. You know, we're savannah creatures trying to cope with the 21st century, not trying to figure out that we've actually invented the 21st century from the savannah. And I prefer, rather than Homer, I prefer Lisa Simpson, whereas Lisa is an expressive, ethical, creative person. Of course, between those two is Bart, who's Loki and just wants to rip everything to pieces. But it's at least an interesting comparison between Homer and Lisa. Okay, how am I doing for time? 10 minutes left. Okay, we can finish early. Okay, if you buy that account of human nature, which is rich and complex, but which has play and creativity as a necessary, adaptive and health and well-being and flourishing inducing aspect of that nature, then what's the society you can build on the basis of that? Or what kind of society could you build? And I mean, just to say as well, I mean, I think that the play in the human condition is kind of, we were sort of born futurists. I mean, what the nudgers regard as mad optimism, futurists should regard through play as our up-for-itness, you know, our sense of wanting to kind of go forward and project our imagination upon the future. It's quite a revolutionary thought to think that's actually baked into the human evolved condition. So we're all sort of futurists by virtue of being at birth and continuing through our life, if we can manage it, players. So another nice thing about thinking about play and that's where it ties into the radical animal element, because we're radical animals because we have this play imaginative prefrontal cortex capacity that can go to the root of things, break them apart and send them into interesting fragments again. But I don't want to overstate the point. You know, there are lots of play idealists and play advocates and play evangelists. As Kant said, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. So play it's great to create spaces that support more playfulness because it has all these invigorating, enlightening and future-friendly effects. But it's not the only way to deal with a social order, a social structure adequate to a complex vision of human nature. But I think it's unfairly neglected. That's why I want to stress it today. So what would those... I flipped the phrase playground round. What would those grounds of play be that answer that element, that baked-in element of human creativity? We have quite a lot already of these grounds of play, and we should value the ones that we have. 3 to 7 play-based kindergarten. Look at all the top OECD nations. They all have that as an aspect of their education system, and they're all at the top of the OECD education indicators. That's really not rocket science. The web for 15 years has been a ground of play, supporting mass self-expression for good or ill, but that's what it's been. It's been a playground. Festivals and carnivals and book festivals have flourished, burst up in the last 10, 15 years. I think that's a sociological response to the shift of our economic system from a kind of Homo economic, Homo et femina economicus to Homo et femina ludens. Arts and cultural sectors and their subsidies must be defended because they keep open play zones. Primary science, I think, is also very tied to play. If you look at Hawking's, even existence in life is often very playful. Andrew Geim, who discovered graphene in Manchester, explicitly values the role of play in primary science. So we already have good play zones. Let's defend them. We should be aware and alive to create new ones. Aeon VR has already been mentioned. But do we have the kind of Berners-Lee moment for Aeon VR, which is what is the open, common, expressive protocol that means that we're not just being programmed by Aeon VR platforms, but that we can program or that we can shape them? We maybe need to think about care zones as well as play zones, because the whole work-life balance thing is this mad schizophrenia between the work that you don't want to do and the life that you don't want to live, and you're pulled either way. A play-care continuum might be, well, here's the play, here's the kind of creativity-centred life that we want to live. How do we need to be capable and energetic enough for that life? So maybe it's play-care rather than work-life. Okay, and finally, how could we bring the vast array of creative techniques that are now available to us in 2017 to bear on our broken politics, which is the kind of thing that David was talking about, and the kind of thing that the alternative will be talking about later on. Okay, just very, very quickly, the planet. Some of you might be aware of the Planetary Limits literature on ecology, the idea that we have 7, 8 or 9 limits that if we stay within, if we don't breach these thresholds, then we can be the kind of human beings that we want to be, as long as we don't tip over on either of those edges. It's quite an interesting point. There's a couple of thinkers that I've been exploring, and I'm sure you know them, who look at this idea of the planetary limit being, if they're maintained, then there's a human playground within which we can be as inventive and ingenious as we want. Just don't trip over those ecological limits. Stuart Brand is a very interesting case study in this. Starts off in the 60s with the Merry Pranksters saying, we are gods and we might as well get good at it. And then he shifts to the whole earth discipline in 2000 and saying, we are gods and we must get good at it. And the first statement is DIY, small is beautiful, and the next statement is we'll have to terraform and use nuclear power because it's such a crisis situation. Now, is he right or is he wrong in this? I'm not sure, but he's being a player and he's being, a radical animal in trying to think to the limits of how we solve our problems. And I think that's, again, one of the interesting things about putting play and creativity at the core of a system, is that it generates many options. It should, we should happily be able to entertain many options for the future of our society in a play space. Mark Lynas also talks about this. He talks the safe operating space of humanity can also be a play space. And Tim Flannery is also interesting in that as well. Okay, final point. I reviewed Homo Deus for the New Scientist. I was really privileged and happy to do it a couple of months ago. And it's interesting, Harari often has this kind of vision at the end of his book. Have you all read it? Have you all read Homo Deus? Maybe quite a few of you? Yeah. And he has this he's a sort of algorithmic fundamentalist. He sort of thinks that we will all end up just being versions of the computation of matter or information. And he says that there's a new religion coming in Silicon Valley called dataism. Whether that comes, I don't know. But the really most interesting part of his book is that he says, what's the difference between consciousness and intelligence? And he says the difference between consciousness and intelligence is that his test for whether something is real or not is, does it suffer? Does it have a sense of self that can feel that life is affecting it in a certain way, rather than just simulating that? Yet, Mr. Harari, we are the animal that can think that, and we are the animal that could reframe that on a dime. So the nature of the radical animal, this is what we're trying to do with this book that we're trying to write, is that this power of imaginative reframing that is the distinctive element of the human condition is not just about our future technological development or this future social development. It's sort of something that we have to sort of cope with. The great philosophers, Nietzsche is probably the best example, Foucault, Deleuze. There's lots of philosophical angsting about the creative power of being human, both for good or for ill. And there's just to kind of remind you that there are fundamental questions here about the nature of the human condition that a lot of future talk has to sort of keep remembering. And just to close, final thing, recently, I think one of the technologies, to use it in the Foucault sense, of the self that I've begun to explore myself is mindfulness. But I think it's interesting to play and mindfulness. Play is a zone for safely exploring all possibilities, and mindfulness is a way to use consciousness to observe our reactions. So somewhere that's something to sort of explore, is the zone of self-management or self-awareness that both play and meditation generate. And if we are building institutions, as David said in his opening presentation, institutions that match the dynamism and power of the moment, they can be softer, more humane, more psychological ones that explore some of these questions, as much as exploring what we do with singularity, or what we do with exponential computation, or computation in biology or information or whatever it is. So yes, so there's my promulgation of the power of play and all your status as inherent radical animals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'd like to hear some voices from the floor as well.
Just basically, if you hear a question and I don't answer it adequately, please shout up and I will then go to the next question.
So, we will maybe take one or two voices from the floor.
Just to hear you.
There are a few other. I'm trying to go with the technological floor.
I love it. I'm just being both and.
Yeah, both and, yes. So, what are the mechanisms we can already do in our current institutions? If we buy into this idea of playfulness and creativity, can you give some practical examples?
Sure. Well, I gave a few of them in some of the slides, which is to say, for example, there's a campaign called Upstart. It's in Scotland, but it's going all over the place, which is just saying, look at the outcomes from 3 to 7 play-based kindergarten in terms of child development, in terms of academic development. It's to let children play at the appropriate stage where they should be playing brings incredible benefits to your society as not just a smarter society, but as a more emotionally grounded society, which allows you to be smart. That's the point about play, is that it knits together and provides a good foundation for being a human being going forward. So that's something. Get involved in kindergarten campaigns, if you want to be thinking genuinely about the next 20, 30 years and the functionality of people.
I'm going to do just what you advised me.
Sure.
That's my question. Is what I was trying to get at was in fact what the Alan Watts point was on your last slide, is actually kindergartens are a place which is set aside for play, and we let the kiddies play, and if we're enlightened, we understand that they're learning better by playing than they would be by sitting there doing their ABCs. But what I'm getting at is how can we be playing all the time? Because that's the what are the interfaces that are now helping us move that way?
Talking to a pal last night about the effect of the 6-hour day in Stockholm. People are just more chilled out, have more time to extend themselves, have a better balance between their heteronymous and their autonomous lives. I think the argument for universal basic income has a strong element of play advocacy in it. If we can work from the biology on play and looking at how would I put it? It really helps human flourishing. It really tangibly does help human flourishing. So there are lots of institutional, incremental changes and evolutions that can happen. But Arthur C. Clarke, the only thing I disagree with Arthur C. Clarke, that says the goal of future full unemployment is so that we can all play. I would say the goal of future self-deployment, not full unemployment, but self-deployment. And I think self-deployment often needs spaces in which you can think freely at the length of time that you want to think in the environments that you need to do that. And often that means political economy, pushing back and pushing back certain structures and pushing forward others.
So if we as adults want to play more or be more playful,
be creative, active citizens, and follow some of the agendas that I'm suggesting and others would suggest as well.
And if you had to choose between the 6-hour working day versus universal basic income as a campaign to get behind, which one do you champion most?
Can I say both? But I'm not allowed to. You're giving me a wicked.
You're
giving me a wicked choice there. I would say that it's probably easier to get shorter working week because that's part of a long tradition that comes through labour movement activism, and also again the science is in on how toxic presenteeism is to the optimal performance of a company. So maybe 6 hours first and then move on to basic income.
I'm going to give the mic to Dean Bubley because he's another both and person. There's another conversation that's going on as well. It's on Twitter, and Pamela McLean and Dean Bubley have been posting lots of provocative and interesting comments there under the hashtag LONFUT. So since you've been commenting there, Dean, I'll give you the mic to comment in real life too.
Cheers. My understanding was the 6-hour day was a 2-year trial in Sweden, which has now come to an end with inconclusive results, quite slightly. But separately, probably the world's biggest real-life experiment in play is going on right now in the middle of Nevada, at Burning Man, which is 75,000 people just playing, being creative, being self-expressive.
Yeah.
It's been an interesting experiment because it has, firstly, it's bloody expensive. And it also involves taking 75,000 people and fuel and water to the middle of the desert, which is not the most sustainable either. What lessons, if any, can we take out of what is going on right now? If you look at the way that the Burning Man culture has changed because of human nature, as well as allowing creativity to flourish.
I mean, as I understand the Burning Man, the ethos of Burning Man is that they leave the playa as they find it. Yeah. So sustainability is kind of an aspiration. Do no evil. I think Burning Man is the template for a lot of other temporary autonomous zones and festive zones. That, as I say, sociologically, just count the amount of time that people want to spend being festive and being in a carnival atmosphere. I think Boomtown was on just about a week ago. I mean, that's literally an immersive, that's literally a great narrative studied with bands about how you want to live your life, where you want your society to go. So I think there's a lot of, if we're looking for the new institutional organisational forms that match an information creativity driven system, right in front of us and right underneath us, we don't need to go to too much utopian planning to sort of find them. The interesting question is, I'll give you a classic example from a great colleague of ours, Pete Lawrence, who did the Big Chill concerts, is now doing something called Campfire Convention, which is a kind of like a Facebook, an activist Facebook movement. And he is inspired by the experience of people having a great time in a field with the fact that they carried that interaction online. And he's trying to make a political movement out of that festival experience. That's the kind of thing we should be looking for, and other unpredictable stuff as well.
So the next London Futurist event should be something closer to Burning Man.
Yes, a bit, yes. If you all want to kind of strip off and cover yourselves in body paint right now, that's absolutely fine by me.
There's another top-ranked question which I do want to ask you to respond to, Pat. So in this society that you envisage, in which we are more playful, what's the role for business and capitalism? Has it all gone? Is it a truly post-capitalist society in that sense?
Well, one of the interesting things about the scholarship of play is that Hayek was one of the greatest advocates of Homo ludens. The whole idea of the catalaxy in Hayek's economics was the idea that there was this kind of interacting space that emerged outcomes from people's enterprises and endeavours. I think we have to go anthropological on the market and look at the market as a sort of form of reciprocation that goes all the way back to trade enabling trust structures in prehistoric societies or in paleontological societies in 10,000 years ago. I think Matt Ridley's book, The Rational Optimist, is actually a great account of the anthropological requirement and power of trade and reciprocation to generate cultural difference and also to generate wealth and specialisation of tasks. So I would prefer to get down to that level of the relationship between market and human rather than obsess about joint stock companies or heaven forfend neoliberalism. I think markets are an expression of human complex coming together, as is a cooperative, as is a mutual. So
I'm pretty promiscuous.
Two more quick questions from the floor.
Economic value history.
Thank you, Pat, for very informative talk. I'm just wondering, really, because we're talking about the future, the technology and the artificial intelligence and robots and so on. So maybe for future, your talk could be about vertical robots rather than vertical animals, because I think that's what unfortunately we are turning into. And Derek talked about robots playing a role, and I think my worry is not really about the robots and artificial intelligence. My worry is about we turning into robots. And I think the good examples are, you talked about the Iraq war and invasion of Libya and so on. The younger generation And we also talk about this smartphones. So these are very important. Now the thing is that this is also turning us into robots because people don't think anymore. They are sitting and chatting all the time and whatever. So I think that this is really it's a question of how can we think ourselves and how to we can criticize the governments. The governments are, because we are using these things, the governments can ask free to do whatever they like. So I think that's a problem.
Very briefly, the question that Harari poses at the end of his book is one of the things that we have to think about for the next 20, 30 years is what is the distinction between consciousness and intelligence? Because if we have AI that can beat humans at games, and will probably beat humans at all games up to a certain point, and that's the relationship between play and intelligence. So there is an element of play, certainly the game subset of play, which is, and that also works in terms of, algorithms crunching data sets to come up with expertises that are better than human expertises. So that's intelligence. The relationship between play and consciousness, as in, and that's a really thorny discussion as to whether you think consciousness can arise from a silicon substrate, could arise from artificial intelligence. I think that's a very juicy and interesting topic. And I think that's where other people come into the discussion. Perennial wisdom comes into that discussion. Existentialism comes into that discussion. Neuroscience comes into that discussion. Art and creativity comes into that discussion. So the question is, in terms of play and consciousness, are there frontiers there which are yet to be broached? Harari, in his book, talks about the Magellans of inner space rather than outer space. So is there something, can the technology and maybe also the pharmacology start to develop human consciousness to a level of playfulness, to a level of imaginative realization, which, the shamans and the ancients perhaps hinted at, but which may actually become, that level of intensity and psychedelic reality may become a banal experience, or may become an everyday experience. What happens to a society when we're all somewhere near where Alan Watts is, or at least we can be laddered to get there psychobiotechnologically? That's off the chart, in terms of what is possible at that point, imaginatively.
Just to take another American-focused example of a concentrated play area, we might look at Las Vegas. And is that a vision of the future that we're really wanting to move towards?
I would like to see the follow-up to Las Vegas, because if you look at the play scholarship, play as throwing yourself upon fate and chance is one modality of play. Play as self-development and education is another modality of play. Incidentally, it's the most unionized town in America, Las Vegas. That's the point I'm making between play as consciousness and play as intelligence. There's a constantly refreshed meta-awareness that should be what we get, is the benefit from play evolutionarily to us, and we should be able to make great decisions about technologies, for example. But as I say, it goes off into the arts, culture, perennial wisdom, meditation, religion, spirituality end, which is a resource that we can draw on to draw a bead on the future.
Pat, it sounds like we should have a 2-hour futurist meeting devoted to the...
If you wish.
Yes? And when
as long as we're all in body paint, I don't care.
Body paint, right. So thanks very much.
Thank you.